RD2RD Live Show. I am excited to have Elaina. Is it Efird? Is that correct? Efird. I knew I was going to do it wrong. Yep. Elaina Efird on today to talk about metabolic testing. And I'm going to be the first one to say I'm really not an expert on the use of, metabolic testing equipment, especially in kind of a clinical practice, working, using it to guide client work. But I think it's so important because we know that as our clients who've maybe been, on chronic diets, what's going on with their metabolism? How are they burning fuel? What is their body composition? I think this is all important, but access to the type of equipment that you need, and there's different kinds of equipment. So the more I started to look into this topic, the more I wanted to kind of dig in with someone who kind of uses this on a day in and day out basis, and not just any metabolic testing equipment. The Kahm Clinic actually reached out to Nick, who's the founder of the Kahm Clinic, and he graciously allowed Elaina to come on today to talk about kind of the technology and how you guys use it in your practice. So Elaina, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of start things off. I want to learn a little bit about you, let the listeners find out kind of what your path was as a dietitian and how you kind of came to be working where you are now, and talk about maybe what you love about it, what's, just tell us a little bit about your career.
Yeah. So I started out, I'm sure a lot of dietitians started out this way, doing general clinical, just kind of something in a hospital setting. And then actually from there, I transitioned to inpatient eating disorders. And I did UNC Chapel Hill. And it was there that I was also, on top of doing that, interning at North Carolina State University with their athletics department. And most athletic departments that are bigger and, can afford it have what's called the bod pod. And the bod pod is how they measure body composition analysis and actually metabolic rate. And so my first exposure to this was at NC State, and we would do it on athletes with relative frequency and kind of explain that data to both coaches and the athlete themselves. So that was my first experience with it. And then we actually moved to Vermont, and that's when I found the Kahm Clinic. And I, in my job search, saw that they were using the metabolic test as a part of what they do. And that's how I got here. So it was a really good fit because the machine that we have actually is the same company that makes the bod pod. So I kind of already knew a little bit about how that worked. And then, so yeah, my job here now is primarily outpatient, but we still do work with a lot of athletes and eating disorders. And of course, some other just general nutrition and weight management, but that's where I am today.
Yeah, I saw that you're both a certified eating disorder dietitian as well as a sports dietitian. I was like, wow, like that's a really interesting combination. I was like, do you just have two major loves, or?
A little bit of that for sure, but I actually learned in working in both fields that unfortunately they overlap a lot too.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It seems like they're two very different specialties when really there's a lot of overlap.
Unfortunately and fortunately, we have, people like you who are specialized in kind of this field. So, okay. So I want to kind of start general, and then maybe we'll get granular for those of you listening in. We're going to talk about kind of how you use this. How do you talk to clients about the information? How do you incorporate it into your practice? But I want to just start broad. So I want to talk about kind of, what is why it's important, what type of testing. You talk about the bod pod. So what is this in comparison to, an in-body scan, or just kind of the different types of technology, maybe using brand names that people might recognize, and other technology elements, like what makes them different?
Yeah. So, the brand I'm most familiar with is COSMED. That's the company that I've worked the most with. But so they have a lot of different kind of levels of how they do metabolic testing and body composition analysis. So the bod pod, like I was saying, which is used primarily with athletes, that measures metabolic rate, but also does the body composition analysis at the same time. So they sit in literally what looks like a pod, and then they get all of that information. The test that we use is also made by Cosmed, but how it works is you actually sit under this bubble while just sitting in a chair, and you breathe, and it measures your carbon dioxide out versus oxygen in. It's a lot more similar to how you would use, for example, a metabolic cart that is in a lot of, inpatient settings. However, that test only tells us metabolic rate and then what's called substrate utilization, which is your body's breakdown of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And then we have another machine that does the body composition. We just use them in concordance with each other. So what I know about a lot of the other companies is kind of similar to that. Like there's, for example, the InBody scan. Yes, it gives you your body composition analysis, but my understanding is that they're just using Harris-Benedict or methylene something to calculate a metabolic rate, because of course you're not breathing into the InBody. And so there's a lot of machines like that as well, where I don't know brand names, but I know there's some metabolic tests that you just put this mask on your face. And so of course that's giving you a metabolic rate, but it's not giving you the substrate breakdown of that use of carbs, protein, and fat.
Let's dive in there. So, because there are tests, like maybe in-office tests that you can use, right? MedGem, is it like MedGem? There's I've seen them.
Oh yeah, right? MedGem is one of them. Yeah.
You wear them and they're going to tell you so why is it important to have kind of the substrate breakdown in addition to kind of that raw number?
Yeah, so the substrate is actually what we focus on almost primarily, because if the body's not being fueled enough, and a lot of us know this, but if the body's not being fueled enough, it's going to start breaking down muscle, which we would see with that high protein substrate utilization. So, and a lot of people automatically assume like, oh, well, my client's eating 2,000 calories a day, they're fine, they're totally eating enough. But then we see that protein turnover is too high. And that means that even though, based on our general clinical knowledge, we thought they were eating enough, their specific body actually needs more. And then similarly with their breakdown of fat or carbohydrates, depending on what the person's nutrition goals are, if we're not seeing those numbers look how they should in terms of the body breaking down fat, or maybe still breaking down too many carbohydrates in a fasted state, it just helps us better understand what we need to do with food to help this person meet their goals. So again, it just gives us a really good internal picture of how the body's currently compensating. And even if just reading their dietary intake or whatever they're doing for physical activity on the day-to-day seems great, it might not be what's best for their body.
So that's kind of interesting. So is there a specific type of client that you would say really needs this level of testing? What draws people to the clinic, and why do you go, this person's just it's important that they have access to this type of technology?
So eating disorders are, of course, a huge one, because,
RD2RD
individuals who work with eating disorders, the main focus is weight. And as people who are familiar with eating disorders know, there's plenty of times that their BMI or whatever the doctor is tracking is normal, but really they're still really entrenched in that eating disorder. So we're able to see, for example, with the protein substrate utilization, if that's way above where it should be, we know that the body's still really underfed and they're not fully recovered, even though weight may look okay. That's definitely one. The other group that it's really, really helpful for are some of those folks who, totally on the flip side of eating disorders, some of those weight loss folks that are really, really struggling to see any sort of weight change, no matter what other interventions they may have dealt with. Because again, with the substrate utilization, we can see if maybe there's something going on internally that we haven't previously tried with food, or the body's hanging on to fat for, who knows, insulin resistance or whatever else it might potentially be. I would say those two populations are the best. And then of course with athletes, it's always great, because if it's someone who's trying to increase that power to weight ratio, we can help with that and make sure that they're not breaking down too much muscle, etc.
So what misconceptions, when clients come in and have, to have this technology, what are their misconceptions, and how do you set that up so that they really understand? It's complicated, right? How do you break that down for them, and what are they getting wrong, I guess?
Well, of course, one of the most common misconceptions is actually how much you need to eat. Everybody comes in thinking that they need to eat 1,200 calories. That's still so many individuals. And you really have to educate, like, let's say someone's metabolic rate is 1,600 at rest. We really have to educate that that's at rest. That's not including anything else you're doing in the day. So that's one of the biggest things is they expect that they're going to come in and we're going to tell them that they're eating too much when oftentimes they're actually not fueling enough. The other very common misconception is that if their body is breaking down too much muscle or they don't have enough muscle mass on their person, it means they're not exercising enough, which also is not the case. A lot of times it actually means that they're not eating enough to fuel whatever exercise it is that they're doing. So I would say those are probably the two biggest misconceptions that they get about the testing. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in particular. Maybe the only other thing is with the body composition. Some people have a hard time separating that. It's not uncommon for example, if you're trying to build muscle, you may actually gain a little bit of fat with building muscle, but that means they're doing something wrong when that's not necessarily the case. It's just kind of the natural trajectory of how your body's going to restore muscle or do whatever it is we're trying to focus on.
So looking at those different populations with eating disorder population, how do you talk about these test results? What approach do you take? And how do you, if for someone maybe who doesn't have access to this technology, how do you think it might look different in your practice versus others?
So how I educate them is, well, we print out the metabolic test information and it's really just showing them because we always compare it, of course, to kind of a reference or normal range for someone at age, height, and weight. So with the metabolic test, we can show them like, hey, your metabolism really should be maybe around 1,500 calories, and it's actually 1,100, which tells us that your body is compensating for not being fueled enough. And with the body composition, we actually, that's more of a tool for us as the clinician. So we don't really share a lot of the very specific numbers with the body composition because, as I'm sure you can imagine, or not, people get very
caught up in the numbers.
Yeah, so those numbers are actually, we don't share, they're really just for us so that I know how to take that data and then translate it to whatever I need to do with food. Now, I may, of course, tell them trends. So, of course, it's a client-to-client basis who I think can handle different information. I, of course, tell them like, hey, things look really, really great. Your muscle mass improved, or just something kind of general like that to, of course, give the feedback from it. But I would never tell a client like, oh, your fat came up 1.5 pounds or something like that. I mean, right. So, yeah, and of course, a lot of that's clinical judgment as well.
Right. And I think what you were saying was really valuable about, you using it as the clinician. It isn't necessarily always helpful for, the client to have that level of detail, but it really helps you to guide kind of your clinical practice. I actually thought it was really interesting about, predicted amount of energy and what is actually being burnt, because I think so many people are chronically restricting their intake and kind of that yo-yo dieting, that impact on the metabolic rate, and not having access to technology that measures that. I think it must be really interesting for you to get to see that on a daily basis when you're working with people. What's that? I don't know. I guess I think that's pretty neat.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, I think we, of course, all know this at baseline that everybody's body is different, but it has solidified that for me tenfold. I mean, it's unreal how different everybody's body is and how every single person needs something a little bit different. I could put two people who have an identical metabolic test on a similar meal plan and both persons' bodies are going to respond in a different way. And it's just really cool to see that in data because, again, I think we all know that that's the case, but you don't necessarily get to see it in data. So it's really cool to see how different we all are.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So, dietitians may say, well, I want to have metabolic testing. Maybe they can't afford, the level of technology that you have at the Kahm Clinic. But how do you, I guess you get down to the money thing. Like, payment, right? Like, are people willing to pay for this? Is it part of how you do with insurance? Like, what's that element? Because it's expensive. So how do you make the money up on the back end, right?
Yeah, so a lot of insurance companies will actually cover the metabolic test. So we're in network with a few different insurance companies, and one of them does not cover it, but 2 or 3 of the others do cover it. So you just add it to your billable services. I will say sometimes you get some pushback and you might have to send a little bit more clinical data or do more prior authorizations to get it covered, but you can get it covered. And frankly, the cost of it for those people who do need to pay for it, usually they're willing because it's such valuable information. It's very rare that we have someone that doesn't want to come strictly because they don't want to pay for the tests. And that's actually speaking to a large number of socioeconomic status as well. So it's not just one population that I'm talking about. So that's kind of how. So for the companies that don't cover the metabolic test, we do charge for it, and we do charge for the body composition. But again, we don't really get any pushback for people not wanting it because they know it's going to be good information for their.
Do you structure your visits? You take insurance, but maybe there's some cash pay as well. Is it primarily visit to visit, or do you sell like packages and it's lumped in? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's visit to visit. We have done some packages in the past just for different, like, for example, deals with different employers in the area. We have packages with them, stuff like that. But for the most part, it's just visit to visit.
Okay. I have a question here from Courtney. Wondering about great articles or resources, even patient education, about how underfueling impacts metabolism and the body. So she's wondering about articles or education resources, and then I have a follow-up question. So I guess I'll start there.
Okay. Well, the owner of our clinic, Annika Kahm, and her colleague, her name's Carolyn Hodges Chaffee. She's in upstate New York. They actually wrote a book together. So it's called Measuring Health from the Inside. So that's a really good one that does talk about that. I'm trying to think other specific resources that talk about metabolic rate. That's the thing, is there's not a lot of research. I mean, you could definitely go into the athlete world, right? So I would argue that the athlete world has a lot of information. So, like the Collegiate Professional Sports Dietetics Association, they oftentimes publish the body data every so often every year with that information. So you could look at that.
And she also was specifically about men who don't necessarily fall into that kind of female athlete triad. She has a few male clients who are middle-aged, underfueling based on their, calculated energy, but having a hard time like getting them to believe it, right? Because their weight isn't going down. So I think those are like data and how you educate. She's like, help me.
Yeah. I mean, of course, without having the metabolic test, the way that you educate, I mean, sometimes the thing I say to people is, you've already tried the eating less route and it's not really working, right? So let's just give this a shot. There's more and more, I'm sure you guys have seen out there with like the Health at Every Size movement and stuff. They do have a lot of resources about how underfueling is not going to cause what we think it is. And some of it is just as basic as your body's not a calorie in, calorie out equation. There's so much more going on internally. And so it's kind of the constant education. And I'll say, even with the metabolic test data and body composition, we still of course, get some of those clients that don't believe that they have to. So,
yeah, that's actually really interesting. We just think if we just had this test, our clients would fall into line and they would believe us and they would come on board. But I think you're right. Like
yeah.
But I think you made a good point that it isn't, and we know it's not a calories in, calories out. But I think it's really it's difficult for people who are looking for a certain result, and we're feeling tied to delivering that for them so they stay on as a client. I think it's challenging. So question, and it's in my list, but we'll go ahead and ask it now. How often do you repeat the test? So, you do it upon like the initial visit. Do you do it right away? And then how often are you testing again? Do you test again?
Yeah. So our particular test, you have to be fasted for about 4 or 5 hours in order to do it. So we definitely do it at the initial visit. And then after that, the kind of rule of thumb is that you would do it roughly every 8 weeks.
Okay.
I argue not everybody is happening every 8 weeks because that's kind of where the body composition ties in. You want to make sure your body composition is looking a little bit different before you redo the metabolic test. Because if you do the body composition and you see that their numbers are more or less the same than when you started, chances are the metabolic rate is going to look similar because, muscle is most metabolically active. So if that hasn't really changed, or if it's decreased, the metabolic test may actually look a little bit worse, which is still a helpful tool. But so 8 weeks is kind of the rule of thumb, but I would say realistically, it turns out to be more like every 3 to 4 months. Now, the body composition analysis, that one we do at every visit. So since ours is just bioelectrical impedance, it's very quick. It takes just a minute. And so we do that at every visit. And that can be, every week, every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, just like anybody else's follow-up. So
I guess it's got to be really interesting, having, getting an initial metabolic, test, working with client on maybe building lean mass, doing strength training, and then to come back, right, 8 weeks later and actually get to show the metabolic rate impact. That must feel pretty awesome. I'm sorry, as a clinician, kind of talk to you about how, I guess that's kind of exciting. Do you see those types of results? I don't know, maybe give us an example of someone. I think it would be really fun.
Oh, yeah. Let me think. So, kind of stereotypical, I had someone coming in who was eating 12 to 1400 calories a day, logging it every single day in MyFitnessPal, just, very diligent about intake. Metabolic rate was predicted to be, I want to say like low 1500s, 1510 or something. And it was actually 1090. So it was really low. And then her protein substrate was too high. I think it was like 5 or 10% higher than what it should have been. And so this person was actually a good example too, because was really hesitant to increase food.
Right, because she was not burning fat, clearly, right? At the
yeah. And so was very, very hesitant to increase food, just thought that all that was going to do is make her gain weight, et cetera, et cetera. So we finally kind of worked through it. We're able to increase food, got this person up to eating more like 2100 calories a day.
That must have been, for someone, I know those people who are eating 1300, like the eating 2100 calories, that's a big leap of faith for that person to follow you.
Oh, yeah. And we tapered up to do it. So by the time she was eating 2100, it was probably 6 months out.
Right.
But then we redid the metabolic test, and her metabolic rate was at like 1980. It was super high. Her body was not breaking down too much of her muscle. And this doesn't necessarily always happen so perfectly like this, but and on her body composition, we saw that her fat weight was actually lower. Wow. And so she, of course, became a believer, but but yeah, it's really great to see. And you're right. She was thrilled. I was excited for her, and it was just so cool to see how great the body is at correcting itself, and it worked wonderfully.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, and I think like my heart kind of went, that person who's so diligent, right? They're following they record everything, and they really think they're doing right by their body. I think it's so amazing to have those. Sometimes the numbers really are powerful. So there's some questions coming in. So I'm going to take a little breath here. And I want to go back to this body. You mentioned body composition, and we're kind of jumping between both because they are important. Beth wanted to know your professional opinion on handheld, body impedance testing.
Yeah, I think they're good. My only understanding of the handheld ones is that, and you can correct me if you know this and I'm wrong, is that they don't really take into account hydration status. So, and of course, pending your hydration, you can look leaner or look fatter based on hydration. And so that's actually one good thing about the system that we have is we can see their hydration. So we're able to kind of compare apples to apples, or if we see that they're really a lot more hydrated or a lot less hydrated than a previous data point, we know that comparing those two things maybe isn't going to be super accurate. So I don't think you get that with the handheld. Now, all of that to say, if you have that in mind and you have someone using the handheld and you're noticing that fat maybe like, I don't know, came down 3 percentage points, but then came back up 6 percentage points or just something like that, you just keep that in mind that it's probably hydration.
So I think it's a good point. Thanks for kind of fielding that one. Let's see. We talked about that. Any other questions, guys? Feel free to drop them in. I'm pretty good about keeping my eye on these lists over here. Courtney, yes, I agree. So funny that we're kind of talking about this because she was looking into metabolic testing for one man in particular. So I think that example that you gave and kind of the rationale is really great. Do you want to dive? I know this is going to be nerdy. I mean, we're dietitians here, but talking a little bit about this whole substrate and fuel utilization. So I think as someone who doesn't get kind of a metabolic, I mean, we had a metabolic card. I worked in an ICU, but a little bit different than working with, free living people. Like, I was tube feeding. It's different. TPN, not the same. Talking about when you get those results, kind of what you're looking at. So you mentioned like their fat is too high. Maybe kind of walk us through what you might see and the way you're evaluating that from someone who gets to see it on a regular basis.
So, well, let's say we look at their profile and we see that their body is burning too much of their protein, which is of course muscle, lean mass, all of those things. And instead of burning as much fat as they could for fuel, that looks a little bit lower. What that's actually telling me is that the body's underfueled, and as counterintuitive as this sounds, the body is storing fat, not using it as efficiently as they could be, and breaking down protein as a source of fuel instead. Other situations that we could see is maybe that the body's not breaking down too much protein, but maybe that after, because like I said, they have to be fasted for 4 or 5 hours at a minimum, maybe their body's still breaking down a lot of carbohydrates. Now, the reason we have them fast is because your body really shouldn't be breaking down any carbohydrates after that period. So if they are, that can mean some other things. I mean, it's quite a few different things and you kind of have to sift it through with the client. But if their carbohydrate substrate is way too high, that can be an indicator that, for example, maybe they're eating too much at the end of the day and then their gut's and it's not as effectively getting through food as it should be. So that's kind of what we're looking for with that. And then of course, let's say the body's not as efficiently using fat as a source of fuel as it could be. We take a look at the protein and the carbohydrate to see which one of those we should work on first. So
it's like as you're like doing your diet history and you're kind of looking at this information, layering those two together. So I like this. Keep going. This is good.
Yeah. And so, if, for example, we see someone's carbohydrate substrate is high, and then I'm looking at their diet history, and this person is someone who has just a yogurt for breakfast, a salad for lunch, and then all their food for dinner, then of course we go into the education about how, maybe we need to add more to the early part of the day because your day is primarily backloaded. So yeah, you're exactly right. You kind of take a look at their history and the results received in their metabolic test, and usually they fit in a nice little piece of the puzzle.
Do you get people who maybe are coming in on, intermittent fasting or have done or, ketogenic diets? Like what kind of impact are you seeing on the metabolic rate? Because you get to see it, I'm so going to ask you.
I don't know how to say this.
Just say it.
Pretty much anytime I see someone who has just come off of a diet, any of those fad diets, their metabolic rate is too low and their body is breaking down too much of their protein. Because let's call a spade a spade. I mean, diets are restrictive in every sense of the word. So they've come in from not eating enough. And typically, actually, on the body composition, what we see is probably what you're assuming is pretty much an immediate rebound of fat. So, we see them, for example, I actually had someone who did Whole30 and then came in to see me and had really finished Whole30 the day before coming to see me. So we got her baseline body composition information. And then she came back, I don't know, 3 weeks later or something, fat had come up 7 or 8 pounds. And she didn't go back to just like eating whatever and totally, other end of the spectrum. She just kind of went back to not following Whole30, and that was the result. So that's almost always what I see post-diet.
Mm-hmm. So, I kind of feel like we're at an interesting time in, nutrition or dietetics where we've kind of got right, health at every size, and we've got this talk about, size acceptance, and then we've got, people are still, right, searching for weight loss, seeking us out as clinicians for weight loss as a goal. How do you approach that in your, practice? I always think it's interesting as we do marketing about what do our clients really need. I always want to hear your personal approach as a dietitian. I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I'm very much about size acceptance. I think that, so one of the kind of mantras we use here at the Kahm Clinic is, I'm willing to get you to your healthiest livable weight, meaning you're eating when you're hungry and you're stopping when you're full. You're using practices of intuitive eating. You're exercising because you enjoy it, not because you feel like you have to. And your weight is staying relatively stable. Now, that might not be the weight that you thought you should be at, but if that's the place where your body is comfortable, that's probably where you're going to be. So we very much come from that standpoint of healthiest livable weight. I am not willing to sacrifice, for example, something that I tell a lot of my newer clients is, what I'm not willing to do is see you lose, let's say, 10 pounds in 3 weeks, and 7 of those pounds are muscle. To me, that's not a win, right? Even though you're happy that that scale weight is lower, that's not a good thing. So, and how we kind of translate that here is, to me, that's kind of sacrificing your health, right? Muscle and lean mass is correlated to immunity and longevity, and I'm not willing to sacrifice that just because someone told you or you think you're supposed to be at a certain weight. So that's kind of that approach that we take. The other thing is, of course, and this isn't even tied to metabolic testing your body composition, but just focusing on things like hunger and cravings and body image and all of those like non-scale things. So that's the approach I take. Now, on the total flip side, there probably are people that can appropriately lose weight, but again, it's reshifting what those weight goals might be. So if someone comes in and thinks they have to lose 80 pounds, chances are they probably don't, and even just 20 of them might feel a lot different or help in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. I love that you, the way you explained that. And I think sometimes we get, thinking of, okay, we're going to do a metabolic test and we're getting this number and we're using it for a prescriptive diet. I think for you, it's the clinical picture. It's, what do I need to best help people get to, where they need to be, and how do I best operate as a clinician? That this is invaluable information. It's not because I'm going to tell you this is how many calories you need. I just think it was beautifully said. So well done. Another question though, Sahela, what are the macronutrient percentages you aim for with people who are breaking down their protein and muscle mass?
I really don't give them any specific macronutrient goals. There's no specific percentage. Let me just say that. It all depends on what their diet history was. And, of course, if I see that there's something that's glaringly too low, like protein or fat or carb, just something along those lines, I will tell them to increase it. But typically it's actually just a matter of increasing their overall intake. There's not really a, what's the word I want to use, special recipe for specific macro content.
So when you see that protein breakdown is too high, even going through some of the hit list of things that Elaina does to kind of, what are you thinking of? What are you doing? You mentioned some of those. So anyway, let's see. Oh, Courtney wants to know if you've published your outcomes, and that might be something I'm just going to be like, you guys need to do a study. Can I help you with data?
Yes. So we're working on it. So we're actually in the process of building out this huge database that is going to collect, of course, anonymous data, but collect all of the data. Working on publishing it. It's probably going to take a while because, you know, that's a lot of data to collect and a lot of releases to be signed and all those things, but we're working on it. There really isn't a lot of research, especially big research out there, but Nick, who's our business guy here, all about it. He's working, I think he's working with GW or someone there to populate this database and create it. So when it is published, you'll know.
Right. And I know you're in Vermont, but for other people who don't know, the Kahm Clinic actually has 3 locations now.
Yes.
One's like down the street from me, literally like a mile, which is hilarious.
Nice.
In Boston area.
Yeah, so we have one in Newton, Massachusetts, one in the Phoenix, Arizona area, and then we're up here in Burlington, Vermont.
Okay, so for those of you who didn't know, you said you were in Vermont. People are like, that's forever away, or maybe not. But
I know.
I love Vermont.
Like Vermont's a place.
No, I moved from the West Coast to the East Coast, and Vermont was like this alluring place. Like, I need to go because how else are you gonna, like, it's kind of out of the way. I love Vermont. It's just so beautiful. So really is just gorgeous. Okay, so let's get back to, I want to talk a little bit more because time always goes way too fast. So kind of lessons learned about metabolic testing and maybe what you would want other dietitians to know that maybe are thinking about adding this to their practice, or clients that are asking, like, you know, should I be getting this done? Kind of your advice.
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest thing is a lot of what we've said already is really using it for you. So as the clinician, I mean, so not bombarding your client with all of these numbers about everything that we're getting. And again, using clinical judgment as to what numbers are going to be appropriate for what client. You know the clients that you have that it's going to be too much for them, and you know the clients that really need the information. So really using it for you, for your information and your guidance, I think that's helpful. The other thing is, I really encourage that people do get the metabolic test or body composition done and not treating it as like an a la carte item, or like, oh yeah, if you want to, you're going to integrate it in. I think it's good to be a part of what you do. Mostly because, again, it gives you such good data and it helps you learn so much more about your client's body that you, even if they don't want to know the information, you can track what's changed when you know you, I don't know, let's say you did decrease the amount of fat that they take in or whatever it is, you can see how the body composition changed with that. Right. So nothing else, you get the good information from it.
Mm-hmm. And a geeky statement, I'm kind of jealous about the PES statements you could write because, you know, just kidding.
So such detail.
Oh, yes, all those codes. You're like, I can legitimately use this as evidenced by statement. Okay. Yes, that was a dork moment, everyone. All right, so. That was really great tidbits. So, all right, how can people connect with you, learn more about the Kahm Clinic, what you're doing? I won't bombard you with a billion questions, but how can people?
Yeah, I mean, always feel free to just shoot us an email. I mean, you can hit the contact us on our website, but our website is actually really good. We do have like a resources page on there. We do relatively regularly update our blog, which often has stuff like this, or sometimes our blog will have case study examples of people that we've seen.
You have a killer explainer video. I'm kind of a geek for explainer videos. I had one made for my website, but the little like cartoony explaining, and I think sometimes that's difficult, but just that explainer video about why you use the technology you do at the Kahm Clinic, it's a super, I'll link to that in the comments because I think people could, it might be something clients might be interested in watching because it's really a cool video.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And then of course we're on Instagram. We update that. All of kind of the normal outlets, but I would say we're pretty good at those kinds of things, the explaining, because we know that not everybody uses this technology in this way. So we do try to make sure it's really well understood by looking us up or curious about things.
Yeah, I love it. This was super helpful, and I really was, I want to say I was a little intimidated by this topic, but let's say I am kind of intimidated by this topic. I don't work in sports nutrition. I'm not an eating disorder dietitian. I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to sound like a complete idiot asking these questions. So thank you for being gentle with me and diving in and tackling these. So anything I forgot or any like burning things that have popped up that you want to share?
I don't think so. I think I think this was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and being a part of the RD2RD Live Show. And we will, if there's questions, I know some of you will be watching this over replay. So if it's something I can answer, or maybe I'll, reach out to Elaina and maybe loop back around with answers. So thanks again. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another guest. So we're going to continue this through 2020. I'm always assessing like what's adding value for the RD2RD community. But personally, this is one of the most favorite things of what I get to do. Online business world is kind of lonely. So this is a couple of highlights of my month. I'm like, ooh, another human, even though it's through a computer. So it's super fun. All right. Great. Thanks, Elaina, for being on.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.